Shalom and blessings from Israel. Eduardo Yosef speaking to you here from the land of the Bible where I have been living for several years now. A few months ago, that is, when we were almost in the first months of the pandemic. Back in 2019, the Lord spoke to our lives and asked us to be a bridge of blessing. To those people who love Israel, who want to connect with Israel, but still don't know how to do it. I know that many of you look for information about Israel. You try to connect with people in Israel. And it's very difficult to connect with believers who live in the land of the Bible. We have been here since 2002, and for many years we have been working in this nation, trying to bless the nation. And to this day, we try to do it in a very, very special way. Through different simple steps that we carry out under strategies that God Himself gave us. As you saw in the title of this video, Jesus has just entered, or rather the Messiah has just entered Jerusalem. The reality is that the Messiah has already entered Jerusalem. But in a culture where many of you who are on the other side of the world don't have it completely clear. That is, when he entered the city of Jerusalem, he entered in a language as it is spoken today. He found a culture, as in many cases you find today, with many religious movements, just as you find today. That is, today's Jerusalem is almost very similar to the Jerusalem of 2,000 years ago. And what are we going to do today? That's why I'm going to ask all of you on the other side to pay very, very, very close attention to me. Because what we're going to do today is travel back 2,000 years and discover the person of the Messiah from a historical, archaeological, and geographical point of view. In other words, we're going to try to transport ourselves exactly to the city of Jerusalem and see. In the week when he entered Jerusalem, which was the week of the Feast of Tabernacles, he performed a miracle that day in a very special way. And the reality is that many things happened when they came out of his mouth in the culture he was in. But many, as I said before, who are on the other side of the world can't really understand the general context of the Messiah. And there are many debates about the historical Jesus. We are bringing here a part that is class number 6 out of 8 classes from a course called the Historical Jesus, which is part of our academy, online, exclusively from here, from Israel. That's why I told you from the beginning that God sent us to bless many of you who are on the other side through different archaeological, historical, and biblical courses from believers for believers so that you can understand the scriptures in the context in which the biblical events were written. 80% of the biblical events happened here, in the lands of the Bible, in the place where we breathe and walk every day. We have had and still have the blessing of being here. And from here, we want to be an extension of arms and feet to you who are on the other side of the screen. So I'm going to ask you to pay very close attention to the next few minutes because we're going to show you a video. Go ahead, if you have time, grab a pen and a notebook because you're going to take a lot of notes. If you have the chance to have a Bible nearby, grab your Bible because you'll also be able to compare with your scriptures. Many of the things we're going to share here. And if you have your family nearby, ask them to be quiet because you need to concentrate on what's coming. To see in this material. Again, this is super exclusive material. If you don't have the time right now to stay and watch this class, I advise you not to watch it and to watch it at another time. But if you have the time, then try to be 100% focused on this video. And don't skip ahead, don't rush, don't try to get to the end quickly because it presents ideas in a chronological way. If you miss the idea from, for example, minute 5, you won't be able to understand what's happening at minute 40. So try to be really attentive from beginning to end. And once the video is over, we'll meet here again because I have something important to share with you. So don't skip ahead to the end now, but pay attention to the class, and again, be attentive to what God is going to speak into your life. Without a doubt, you are going to discover something new here that you have never seen before, with the eyes you are seeing it with now. After this class, you will be able to have a different kind of observation of the scriptures than what you have had until now. So pay close attention because you are going to be transported in the next 40 minutes to a higher understanding of the scriptures, understanding the scriptures in their context, in their archaeology, and in their culture, in which the Messiah entered Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. So without further ado, I invite you to watch this class and don't miss it for anything. So go ahead, continue and enjoy this class that we have prepared for you. Well, do you remember that out of all the topics that we have there, there's like a grid of topics, right, that you have in this course on historical Jesus? Are there some? Well, actually, I think they're all really interesting. But today's specifically is one of those that I think, in my opinion, it's really key to be able to understand the process of the Messiah. How they back then, the people he faced, the people of the Second Temple, that is, the different groups he faced as a person on earth. How did he have to somehow be able to prove that all the prophecies were fulfilled in him, or at least part of the prophecies that he wanted? That they be demonstrated publicly, shown in him, so that they can finally recognize him as the Messiah, that is, as the Messianic Jesus. In today's class specifically, it is very interesting, because actually, the topic of the historical Jesus hardly comes up. That is, there is very little we can say about the historical Jesus. Because there is no debate in this specific class. That is, there isn't a debate to bring it up to today and say, no, that's not what happened in history, or that didn't exist in history. Why? Because history couldn't retain the debate that existed in the time of the Second Temple regarding the person of the Messiah. That is, from the point of view of miracles, historically, there's no way to prove whether there were or weren't any, because they are miracles after all. So what can be seen from a historical point of view is where that miracle happened, that is the area, the location, and then testimonies are sought from the people who lived in that time. If anything was left embedded or stuck inside some kind of rock in a house where they were. For example, the miracle of the paralytic, the one in the city of Capernaum, where did it happen? In which house was it? So the debate about the miracle itself, historically it can't be proven, but it can be proven where it happened, and that's where the search begins, whether it really happened, whether it really didn't happen. In other words, that's where all those in charge of history start searching, to somehow try to prove the truth of the miracle, and on the other hand, to try to disqualify the truth of the miracle. But yes, what's interesting here is that many of those who read the scriptures, who read the Bible, haven't fully grasped it. Which miracles were intentional that Jesus performed so that he would be recognized as the Messiah, and which ones were simply out of compassion? That he simply did them because he wanted to do them? You should know, if you didn't already, that in the time of the Second Temple, at some point I told you that it was a period when many people presented themselves as the Messiah. They called themselves the Messiah. It was a very normal time when everyone was waiting for the Messianic era. Remember that for the Jewish people, there is a lot of talk about the Messianic era, and not so much about a person who fulfills as the Messiah. That is, it is known that it is a person, the one who fulfills the role of the Messiah. But everything has to happen, or everything has to take place in a specific era, what they called in the time of the Second Temple, the Messianic era. Why? Because all the conditions exactly had been met for the Messiah to come to earth for the first time. Now the question was, of all those who during that period had self-proclaimed themselves as Messiah, because there were far more than just one. In the case of the New Testament, you will find, for example, Simon, one of those who proclaimed himself as Messiah. In all the rabbinic books, there are a lot of names. There's an incredible list of people who proclaimed themselves as Messiah. Now, the question for the leaders of that time was, how could they identify who truly fulfilled the requirements of the Messiah? So, in today's class, we are going to discover, or we are going to understand a little more deeply, how did the people of that time, the generation as Jesus called them of that time, how did they have the challenge of trying to interpret if he truly was the Messiah, Jesus? Today we are going to see that he tried to do it in the best, most masterful way he could. But sadly, there were many who did not accept him in his time. We know that there were people who accepted him, but we also know that the vast majority in the environment where he was did not accept him. And that was due to different reasons. There were different questions or different laws that the rabbinic Judaism of that time had imposed on the people to put the Messiah into a sort of menu. So they would take a kind of little sheet they had written where they made their determinations. If he fulfills this, he's the Messiah. If he fulfills this, he's the Messiah. If he fulfills this. So it was a list of things, and they would check off like, saw it, fulfilled, or not fulfilled, or not too much, or it doesn't add up for me. So everything was going to depend on what the leadership of that time said. If the leadership of that time raised their finger, gave a thumbs up to say positive, then go ahead. If the leadership of that time put their finger down, then we had the consequence of what happened on the cross. So obviously everything was planned and orchestrated by God, that it had to be that way. It wasn't the leadership's fault for saying, let Jesus go to the cross, but rather it was a divine plan from God that had already been planned since back then. But yes, what we are going to understand is how it was terribly difficult for those people back then to determine if he truly was the Messiah or not. That is why in some way we are going to understand. How is it that nowadays, even today, there is so much confusion regarding the topic of whether the Messiah is going to return? How is it? How is it going to be? What is going to happen? What will take place? So to this day, the Jewish people still have a list, and that list still has requirements. And it's like a kind of menu, so that kind of menu. They are going to determine if the one who has to return, and we know that the Messiah is going to return, is truly the one who was supposed to come. That is, the one who came 2,000 years ago, or is someone else actually coming? Remember that in the New Testament, a similar question was asked. Now we are going to see how it was done. But it is important to understand that for the Jewish people, the Old Testament is inseparable. They absolutely had to base themselves on the Old Testament. And one of the prophets who spoke about the Messianic era was Isaiah. In other words, they couldn't overlook Isaiah. He was the prophet who had told them what was going to happen in the Messianic era. If the Messiah, whatever his name might be, because they knew that even the name would only be revealed in chapter 53, where he would then begin to describe different events that would happen with the Messiah. And he also begins to give a list of names of how it will be. And even today, we know that here in the rabbinate, within the different branches of Judaism, They try to prove that Isaiah 53, when it talks about the suffering servant, is not talking about the Messiah, as they call him the Christian Messiah, when in reality, Jesus, and it's important to point this out, he was not a Christian. He was Jewish Christian. That term comes much later. It doesn't come exactly with the birth of Jesus, but that term is used much, much later. But in the book of Isaiah, who was the prophet that spoke about everything that was going to happen in the Messianic era? He gave certain requirements that Rabbinic Judaism used to make their list of things that the Messiah had to fulfill. And one of them, for example, or several of them, were included in the miracles. That's why, precisely when we talk about the historical Jesus finally becomes the Messianic Jesus. Because he fulfills certain requirements that, according to the prophet Isaiah, were demanded. Or it had been revealed that the Messiah had to fulfill, and Jesus fulfilled them in him. In the time of the Second Temple, these kinds of requirements are specifically fulfilled in the person of Jesus. For example, let's go to Isaiah chapter 35. It says, then the eyes, verse 5, it says, then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing, for waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. And in Isaiah 26 verse 19, it says, your dead will live, their corpses will rise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Here's a list of things that in the Messianic era the Messiah had to fulfill. And what was it that he had to fulfill? Miracles. So there were miracles, which were everyday miracles that even were studied in the rabbinical school. That is, they studied, for example, how to perform exorcisms. They studied how to fight certain spirits that would take over a person, possess someone, and they would somehow communicate with that person. Have you heard people talk about Jewish Kabbalah nowadays? Among all the different currents, there is one that is very, very, very strong nowadays. In fact, there are many believers, sadly, who follow the Jews who practice Kabbalah and get involved in it. On YouTube, they have thousands and thousands of followers on their pages, their social networks, thousands of followers, where they give certain strategies. Spiritual ones who are the Kabbalists, and so it's all very mystical. Why does that happen? Because it also happened in the time of the Second Temple. That is, anyone who studied to eventually become a leader of the law had certain requirements to fulfill. And among those requirements was being able to cast out demons, being able to remove evil spiritual things that were inside some houses, evil spirits and things like that. Back then, there was a lot of possession in the spiritual world, right? So they were trained in that area, but there were certain miracles that were purely and exclusively for the Messiah. In other words, no human being on the face of the earth could do them, only the Messiah. And among them, here Isaiah is telling us about the Messianic era. Isaiah says the eyes of the blind will be opened. Not just anyone could do that, only the Messiah could do it. He tells us the ears of the deaf will be opened, the lame will leap, the tongue of the mute will sing, and he is also telling us the dead will be raised. So those were miracles that were purely and exclusively given to the Messiah. No one else could do them. Why could no one else do them? Because they didn't have the ability. So in today's class, today we are going to go through 4 miracles that only the Messiah was able to do. And we are going to see in the historical reaction of that time what happened with the people. Because they determined in most cases that Yeshua was not truly the Messiah to fulfill those 4 miracles when in reality he fulfilled them. For example, one of the miracles that only the Messiah could perform was the miracle of leprosy. To free a person from leprosy, Did you know that in the time of the Second Temple, and it's very common to read in the scriptures in the New Testament about people with leprosy, that is, there were lepers, and in the Old Testament you will also find the topic that there were people with leprosy. But if you pay attention and follow up on the people who had leprosy in the Old Testament, you won't find much, but well, we'll see that later. The second miracle was the miracle of blindness, that is, giving vision to the blind. The third miracle was the miracle of muteness, that is, the mute's tongue will sing. And the fourth miracle was the miracle of resurrection, that is, the corpses will rise again. So that was going to happen in the Messianic era, and only the Messiah could fulfill it. Now, if we go to the time of the Second Temple, Jesus is already on the scene. He is present there. Look at what it says in Luke chapter 7, verse 11. And it happened afterward that he went to a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him. And a great multitude when he came near the gate of the city. Behold, they were carrying out a dead man, the only son of his mother, who was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." And approaching, he touched the coffin, and those who carried it stopped. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." We know this story in the scriptures. We know that the miracle of the widow of Nain happened. In fact, even today, many people go and visit that place, the small town where this miracle happened, and they go and remember this story. But notice something specifically that happens in verse 18 and verse 16. It says, "The people were afraid. They glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen among us.'" Notice that it says, "A great prophet has risen among us." They're not saying anymore, "Was a rabbi, he rose among us." But they took it to another level. They changed the term. And why did they say a great prophet? Because it still wasn't determined on a national level that he was the Messiah. So no one could call him a Messiah, even though he was fulfilling one of the requirements of the era of the prophets. So why did they equate him with a prophet? Because they said in the era of the prophets, it was said that someone would fulfill this requirement of the Messiah. So they equated him with a prophet because they still didn't dare to say he was the Messiah. Why? Because there was a kind of national law that required it to be done publicly. Once he declared himself publicly as the Messiah, then everyone would follow him without any kind of fear. It's just that the people back then, the rabbinic authority imposed laws that generated fear among the people. So what they did was control the masses in some way with certain laws that they put in place. Look at what it says in verse 18. The disciples of Juan brought him news of all these things, and Juan called 2 of his disciples. And he sent them to Jesus to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we wait for someone else?" When the men came to him, they said, "Juan the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the one who was to come, or should we wait for someone else?" Why is Juan the Baptist sending disciples to ask Jesus if he was the one, or if they had to wait for someone else? Because it had been fulfilled. One of the miracles of the Messianic era. So John the Baptist wanted to be completely sure, even though he hadn't seen or hadn't heard yet about the rest of the miracles that only the Messiah could do. It caught his attention powerfully because for years they had been waiting. That miracle hadn't happened in the territory of Israel, and much less among the Jewish people. The miracle of the resurrection. So John the Baptist is really struck by this and says, oh, what happened here? One of the miracles that Isaiah the prophet said only the Messiah could do. Go quickly and ask him if he is the one. So when they go and ask Jesus if he is the one, Jesus, look at how he responds. In verse 22 it says, "And Jesus answered them, 'Go and tell Juan what you have seen and heard, and pay attention to what he says. The blind see,'" one of the requirements for Messianic miracles. Then he says the lame walk. Then he says the lepers are cleansed. He's giving him a list of miracles that only the Messiah can do. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the gospel is preached to the poor. Many times when the scriptures are read, people read them straight through, sometimes without understanding the context and the culture in which these events took place. So is what you are going to learn in this course or what you are learning today really important? Because it will take you to a much deeper level of understanding. And my advice is to try to share that knowledge with other people. Because many people today, how they take the person of Jesus, maybe too lightly because they don't really understand everything that was fulfilled in that time. If they don't understand the context, then it's really interesting to understand the context of how things happened and when they happened. So we're going to study a little bit about what the miracle of leprosy was. Why did leprosy become one of the miracles that the leaders of the law at that time had considered? That had to be one of the requirements that only the Messiah could fulfill. At that time, there was what was called the stage of investigation. To this day, if they want to investigate whether someone is truly the Messiah, they still conduct the investigation in stages, but we're going to look at it now. How did it happen in the scriptures, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Sanhedrin 98b? It talks about a rabbi with a disciple. This rabbi sits with his disciple, and his disciple asks him questions. And he says to him, how can it be that we discover, or how can we realize who the Messiah is going to be? And the rabbi answers him and says, when you realize that he is sitting on the outskirts of the city, together with the lepers, healing their bandages. So he is saying that's the Messiah. When you see someone healing lepers who is removing their bandages, that's the Messiah. And that's what the Talmud says, and they have it within the rabbinate. So within rabbinic law, it had already been determined that if someone cleansed a person with leprosy, then he would already be considered the Messiah. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, it says that he took the sores upon himself. It's talking about the subject of leprosy, that all the sickness of the flesh was placed upon him. What did leprosy represent in ancient times? It represented uncleanness in life, that's what it was. Did it specifically represent sin? Did it somehow consume the person? They were dead, but still alive. That's why leprosy was something that was unclean for all the people. That is to say, the person had to be taken directly out of the place. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 13 and chapter 14, you have two chapters that are specifically going to be, as they say exclusively, they are talking only about the laws of the leper, where it explains to the priest how he had to act when he encountered a person who had leprosy. For example, in chapter 13, verse 2, it says when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or eruption or a white spot, and there is on the skin of his body something like a sore of leprosy, he shall be brought to a Aaron, the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests, and the priest shall examine him. The sore on the skin of the body, if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of the flesh, it is a sore of leprosy, and the priest shall examine him and declare him unclean. So to declare him unclean, first, there was a 4-step process. Those 4 steps were a process of discovery to determine if the disease this person had truly was leprosy. If it truly was leprosy, then the priest would say, okay, it's leprosy. What did he have to do? Did they have to expel him? He was declared unclean, and they had to expel him. They had to take him out of the camp and leave him outside for 7 days. Then they had to bring him back again to do a second investigation and start doing a kind of cleansing and purification work. Then again, he would be expelled for a few more days, then brought back again, then expelled again, then brought back like this up to 4 times in case the person was completely healed. So the priest had to make 4 types of atonements, 4 types of offerings. in order to completely purify the body of the unclean person and thus be able to reintegrate him back into the camp so he could continue together with the people. Now, this type of miracle or experiment or practice that the priesthood had to do, notice, they say that the priesthood had all the detailed instructions about what to do in case a leper was healed. He never had the opportunity to put the instructions into practice. There are no records of anyone being healed from leprosy. In the law of Moses, what we have is Moses' sister, Miriam, but she was healed directly by God. Remember that she got leprosy because she had spoken with Aaron and the Lord got angry and told them to take her out of the camp. So the Lord himself, God himself, healed her. There was no one else who healed her, but the Lord himself healed her. And we have another case in the Old Testament of Naaman, but Naaman was Syrian. He did not belong to the Jewish people. Therefore, Naaman did not have to present himself to the priesthood. That is to say, the priesthood did not have to investigate him. If he truly had to continue with the people, or if he simply did not have to continue with the people, because he was not part of the people, he was a person from another nation. That is to say, we did not have any case in the history of the Old Testament. There is no case of a leper being healed and that he was investigated and verified by the priesthood. That is to say, there are no records except for the only two that we have here. And we've already said that one didn't belong to the people, and the second was directly cared for by God. Therefore, what Rabbinic Judaism determined is that only the Messiah can cleanse a leper, no one else. That is, God did it. So the only one who has the authority to do it is the Messiah, because he comes from God. That is, the Messiah is God. Therefore, the only one who can heal him is God. But there was a process for this. They followed the process according to Leviticus 13 and 14, which were the laws of the leper. Let's go to the New Testament. In the New Testament, we will find Jesus. And it says in Luke 5:12, it says, "It happened that while he was in one of the cities, a man full of leprosy appeared." It's very interesting what Lucas writes here. Lucas really left us a lot of details in his writing. He says, full of leprosy. Why does he say full of leprosy? Because he completed the 4 phases of the investigation. In other words, he was completely covered and his leprosy had been confirmed. That is, he really was a person who had leprosy. You will notice when you read Leviticus 13 how the priest determines whether a person has leprosy or is full of leprosy or not. Because there were other very similar diseases. In fact, Leviticus 13 says there are diseases, but not all of them are determined to be leprosy. So there is one specifically. If it meets all these conditions, that is, if it goes through this whole process, then it is leprosy. Yes, it is leprosy. And here Lucas is telling us he was covered with leprosy. That is, according to the priesthood, he was covered with leprosy. He came to Jesus, fell with his face to the ground, and begged him, saying, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." We know that Jesus said, "I am willing." Then he lays his hands on the leper, and instantly the man is healed. In verse 14 it says, "And he commanded him to say," Jesus, he commands him not to tell anyone. But instead, he said, "Go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Now here you will understand what Jesus is saying and how he is sending the leper to something that was one of the Messianic miracles that had to be fulfilled according to the law. So here, who were they? First of all, he is talking about the doctors of the law who were the leaders of the Second Temple, what was known as the Sanhedrin. When Jesus says, "Present yourself to the priest, offer for your purification as Moses commanded," for a testimony to them, he is saying, as a testimony to the doctors of the law, those who have recorded that, what are the miracles that the Messiah had to fulfill? So this is for their testimony that another Messianic miracle has just happened. Notice that he tells him, and he's very specific, don't tell anyone, go first to the priest. Why did he have to go to the priest first? As Moses commanded. And here's where it gets interesting, because Jesus commands to fulfill according to the law. That is, Jesus does not cancel the law. Since there are many people out there who say, no, Jesus broke the law, well, Jesus did not break the law. We have to understand well when it is said that Jesus breaks the law, because it wasn't just one law, there were many laws back then. In this one, specifically, Jesus is saying that it will be fulfilled according to the law of Moses. That's how it had to be done. That's how it was written in Leviticus 13. That's how it was written in Leviticus 14. That's how it has to be done. He's not canceling it. He's saying according to the law of Moses. You have to show yourself to the priest, and the priest has to offer sacrifices, burnt offerings for purification, and to determine that the person has truly been healed. So here we are faced with a challenge that the leadership, the doctors of the law at that time, had to face. Jesus now put them in a problem, because in that era, a messianic miracle was happening. That is, apart from all the miracles they were seeing. One of those that was only spoken of by the mouth of prophets appears, which had not happened, and that only the Messiah could fulfill. The Jewish leaders, along with the priesthood, according to the law, had to examine the leper and had to make a decision regarding the person of Jesus. And because only the Messiah could perform that miracle, they had to begin a process of investigation and follow-up. In Rabbinic Judaism, what is known as Phase 1 begins, according to the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 98. Which was the stage of investigation? What was the stage of investigation? They only had to be behind the person who made that miracle happen, but not ask anything at all. Just follow him and watch the act, see how he moved. So they started to visualize it. Notice how this process begins. Book of Lucas, chapter 5. Later on, we see that the miracle happened. Jesus tells him to show himself to them, to the doctors of the law, and go to the priest. So the leaders are faced with this problem, so they gather together. What happened? Did a messianic miracle take place? We have to go to our phase. According to our rabbinic books determine that we have to investigate what has happened because it is one of the proofs of one of the messianic miracles. If he truly is the Messiah or not the Messiah. And this Jesus, who many today call the historical one, we are calling him the historical one in our course. But back then, they were clashing in the real moment, which would later become history. But in the real moment, they were encountering the person who is here, who is happening now in front of us. Luke chapter 5, verse 17. And it happened one day that he was teaching, Jesus, and the Pharisees and doctors of the law were sitting there who had come. They paid attention. Who was sitting there? Jesus was teaching. He was there giving a lesson, as he usually did. But here, Luke is telling us something extra. He's telling us, pay attention to this. He's telling us. And the Pharisees of the law were sitting there, who had come from all the villages of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem. Ultimately, they were in the process that, according to Rabbinic Judaism, was called the investigation. They entered the synagogue, they went where Yeshua was gathering with his people, and they simply started to watch and listen to what Yeshua was going to do. They had to go and bring a report to the Sanhedrin, to Jerusalem, but notice that they even sent people from Jerusalem. For the moment, they were sending leaders of the law from the whole area, that is, from the entire region, he says. And the Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there who had come from all the villages of Galilee, from Judea and Jerusalem. That is, Jerusalem, so that the leaders of Jerusalem would come to take action. Of course, it was something that had caused a lot of commotion, but the leaders of Jerusalem went all the way north, sat where Jesus was teaching, and they were in the process of the investigation. Now something happens at that very moment, and it is
something amazing.
What happens at that moment when Jesus is teaching? And it says in verse 18, and it happened that some men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed. Another one of the miracles was about to happen that they were going to see. They were going to witness something that was going to be incredible. They tried to bring him in and set him before him, but not finding a way to do it. Because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him with his bed, placing him in the middle, in front of Jesus. When he saw their faith, he said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." Pay attention to that, to what Jesus says, because Jesus is being intentional here with those who were sitting. Jesus knew that he was being investigated. He knew they had come to investigate him. So since he knew they had come to investigate him, he had to be intentional. So what did he do? When he saw that they brought the paralytic, he said to him, "Your sins are forgiven," and it causes an uproar. It causes confusion. It creates a situation in that moment. How is this possible? Notice, the scribes and the Pharisees began to argue among themselves, that is, to debate among themselves. They get confused and say, "But who is this who is speaking? Blasphemies? Who can forgive sins except only God?" He is saying your sins are forgiven. Only God is the only one who can forgive sins. What is he saying? This man here, is he blaspheming? But they couldn't say too much. Why? Because they were in the investigation phase. They were forbidden to speak. They couldn't debate. They couldn't question. They couldn't interview. They just had to be observers, nothing more, according to rabbinic Judaism. Just go and watch. You can't argue. You can't debate. You can't interview. You can't do absolutely anything. That would happen in a later phase, which would be phase 2, what is known as the yes, a phase 2, but in phase 1, it's only investigation. That's why they just stayed in their thoughts. They didn't say, "Wait a minute, you're blaspheming." They just stayed silent. They talked among themselves. The investigators said, "This is not possible. What's happening here now, here?" Luke is telling us. He says, but Jesus already knew what they were thinking. So he asks them the question and says, "Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,'" says Jesus, or to say, "Get up and walk"? Now my question is, imagine that you are in exactly the same place. You are the investigators, the ones who came from Jerusalem and have Jesus right there in front of you, and you are conducting the investigation. And Jesus addresses you as investigators and is saying to you, "Let's see, tell me, you investigators, which is easier? To say your sins are forgiven or to say get up and walk?" They don't give an answer, but the easiest thing was to say your sins are forgiven. Why? Because telling a paralyzed man to get up and walk required public faith. It required a public act because there were people present. And if he told him to get up and walk and it didn't happen, it would expose him. So that wasn't easy. It was a difficult thing. So Jesus says, "I choose the easy one. Your sins are forgiven." No one sees it. No one sees what's happening. But so, as they said, only God can forgive. Remember that. They said in their minds, only God can forgive. So, he is saying Jesus. "So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic. "I say to you, get up, take your bed, and go home." That is, Jesus not only did the easy thing, but also demonstrated the difficult one. Fulfilling the thoughts of the researchers. That is, what he simply did first was the easy part. Get up, your sins are forgiven. And it caused confusion. Only God can do this. So he asks them, "Did you see? I did the easy part, but since you said that only God can do this, I'm going to show you that I have the authority to forgive. Get up and walk." Then the man got up and left, it says immediately, rising in their presence and taking the bed he was lying on. He went home glorifying God, and everyone, overwhelmed with amazement, glorified God, and filled with fear, said, "Today we have seen wonders." 1 second.
Messianic miracle.
For us, the miracle that had been fulfilled at that time had happened in front of the investigators, in front of those who were conducting the investigation. Another miracle that had to happen, and only the Messiah could do it, was the miracle of blindness. Now notice that here in this miracle, we are going to enter a somewhat more advanced phase. Jesus had caused a kind of uproar, confusion, debate, and there were still people who were confused. In other words, leaders who truly wanted to do what they had interpreted, who had to recognize the Messiah and acknowledge the Messianic era. But, on the other hand, they were under pressure from the leadership, from the laws, from the doctors, from the law. Those who had guided them during that period, do you remember the 400 years of silence from Malachi to Matthew? God had not spoken to his people. So those leaders had begun to lead their people, and during that period had exercised a great deal of authority over the people. And by exercising a lot of authority, so they had their kind of book of things they had to do, like be by. If all of this is truly fulfilled, then we, the leadership, will determine whether yes or no. It no longer mattered what was written. What mattered was what the leadership of that time said. What Rabbinic Judaism said, sadly, even to this day, remains exactly the same. The rabbis are the absolute authority, even if they are confused. And even if they are doing things completely outside of what is the law of Moses. But they just follow and say it has to be as our rabbis have determined. So here begins the stage of interrogation. Here, yes, they can now start asking questions. They can now start challenging and confronting Jesus. In Isaiah 35, as we read, it says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened." One of the Messianic miracles, the eyes of the blind will be opened. In John 9:1, we have this miracle, which is the miracle. To put it in some way, of all the miracles Jesus performed, this is the miracle that required the most courage. What he was doing there was truly incredible. As he passed by, Jesus saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, notice that this question is a little strange. I don't know if you can interpret it. I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about that question. The question is, who sinned? This man or his parents? So that he was born blind? So what's strange about that question? What's strange about that question? You might be wondering, how can the disciples ask this? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That is, if a person is born blind, at what point did he sin? I mean, how much did he sin? What were the disciples asking here? The disciples said, did this man sin so that he was born blind then, so that he sinned? For him to be born blind, when did his sin have to happen? Did the sin have to happen during the pregnancy period? Do I make myself clear? That's the question the disciples are asking. That is, for him to have been born blind. In the 9-month process, this person must have sinned. If he sinned during those 9 months, then he was born blind. Now the question the disciples are asking is, did he sin then during the time he was in his mother's womb so that he was born blind? Or was it the parents who sinned? Am I making myself clear? It's really interesting to pause and think about this sometimes, because sometimes we just read it really quickly. And we don't pay too much attention to it. But here there's an influence from the rabbinic leadership of the Second Temple period. Why? Because according to rabbinic Judaism, a birth defect was due to a specific sin, that is, either committed by the parents or by the individual himself. That is what rabbinic Judaism taught at that time. The rabbinic interpretation determines that there was something that was called Yetzer Hara in the Hebrew language, which means the evil inclination, and Yetzer Hatov, which is the good inclination. These two inclinations, they in rabbinic Judaism, It is interpreted that it is already present in the womb at the moment the fetus, that is, at the moment it enters. Life in the human being already inside the mother's belly when the human being begins to be formed. But they interpret that the consciousness of the good inclination and the bad inclination is already present in the little baby that is already there inside his mother's belly. So, during the 9 months of gestation, there is a kind of struggle. According to the rabbinate, they say between two inclinations. There is the baby's good inclination and the baby's bad inclination. For example, they said they noticed that sometimes the mother, during the 9 months of pregnancy, feels like she gets little kicks, and the mother is very happy. There's a little kick from the baby, so they can feel that the baby is alive, that it's moving. It moved, but it's giving me a little kick. In Rabbinic Judaism, that represents the child's rebelliousness, meaning the boy, the girl, or the little one that's inside there. He had a bad inclination, so he hit his mother from inside by hitting his mother from within. Then she sins as a consequence, so it will bring her a visible sin. In this case, when he is born, then he is already born blind. In the case of this one, the man born blind. That is why the disciples ask Yeshua because of the rabbinic influence of that time from the Second Temple period. They are asking him, who sinned? This man or his parents? Do you remember? What was Jesus' answer? Jesus, he gives an answer, and Jesus says it was not that this man sinned, nor his parents, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, as I said, this is one of the incredibly bold miracles of Jesus. Not only for what he was going to do, but also where he was going to do it, and at the time he was going to do it. He was going to perform this miracle. During the days of Sukkot, it was one of the most important Jewish festivals for the Hebrew people. This was the Feast of Tabernacles. It was the festival where the blessing for the following year was determined. That is, all the Jews from different parts of the world, towns, villages, wherever they were, they had to go up to Jerusalem. Jesus was in Jerusalem, that is. All the people were in Jerusalem, all the leaders, all the rabbis brought their disciples. Everyone was in Jerusalem. That is, if there was ever a moment for Jesus to be brave on the face of the earth, that was the moment. That was the moment to confront all the leaders of that time. That is, this is the moment that was prepared. So he not only, he goes to a much deeper level. So he not only performs the miracle during the days of the tabernacle, when all the Jews, all the leadership were in Jerusalem, but he does it on a Sabbath, one of the holy days for the Jewish people, one of the days when they determined that they couldn't do anything. And whoever broke the Sabbath broke the law. Remember that in the previous miracle, Jesus did not break the laws. Remember that he said, go as it is written in the book of Leviticus and show yourself to the priest. So he is showing that he is a fulfiller of the law, and he had to be the same way. He had to continue in the same way, being a fulfiller of the law. But at the same time, he had to show that the interpretation of the leaders of that time about the law had gone astray. So he is going to perform a miracle on a Sabbath, on a day when it was not customary to do any kind of work. In addition to that, he tells the blind man to go and wash himself in the pool of Siloam. Now we are going to read the verse, but the pool of Siloam for that festival was the most important place. It's like saying, go up to the temple and knock on the priest's door and tell him to come out and look at you. I mean, it was. What Jesus had done was super important. By telling him to go to the pool of Siloam, he was saying everyone is there. Who was there? The priests were at the same pool, and they went there 7 times over 7 days. That is, every day, the priest would leave the temple in Jerusalem to go down to the pool of Siloam. And not only the priests, but the Levites would accompany him, and all the people were with him, and all the leaders who had come were with him, because it was their chance to see the priests, and they had the opportunity to listen to the Levites. That is to say, everyone, religious, doctors of the law, everyone was at the pool. That is to say, Jesus, what he was doing here, it was clear that he was going to go completely out of the ordinary. If the disciples were there and didn't have courage, that day they had to find it from somewhere, because they were with someone who was totally out of place for that time. Because he was about to face the hardest thing anyone had ever faced before. But he was about to perform one of the Messianic miracles according to the book of Isaiah, and one that had no precedent. Look at John chapter 9 verse 6. Then, having said this, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and he spread the mud on the blind man's eyes. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." I already explained to you what was happening at the pool of Siloam at that very moment. Then it says that the blind man went, washed, and came back seeing. So the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It's him," and others said, "He just looks like him." But he said, I am the one who used to sit and beg." That is to say, an uproar started because it was a public place where they knew him. Obviously, there were people there who knew him, and they started saying, "We know him, we know him." And they started talking among themselves. What happened? And then, in verse 10 it says, "And they asked him, 'How are your eyes opened?'" Question. Until that moment, no one was asking questions. They were forbidden to ask. Here begins the questioning phase, and he asks him, "How were your eyes opened?" He answered, and he said, "That man who is called Jesus made mud, put it on my eyes, and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went, washed, and received my sight." Then they asked him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know. They brought the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. And it was the Sabbath day." Here, Lucas, here again. In the book of John, we are being given a clue that it was the Sabbath day, when Jesus had made the mud and had opened his eyes. It's like opening a parenthesis. Remember, don't forget that this was a Sabbath, a day when miracles couldn't be performed. But it's saying he made mud. That is, not only did he perform the miracle, but he also worked. Do I make myself clear? That is, what he is saying here is that he worked, he made mud. The mud wasn't already made. He made it, and to make it, he had to work. And he is telling them it was the Sabbath, don't forget. And he made mud. And he opened his eyes. So they asked him again. Did the Pharisees also again? The questioning continues. Also the Pharisees. "How did you receive your sight?" he said to them. "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see." Then some of the Pharisees said, "That man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." They paid attention, as Zeloto does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, "How can a sinful man, that is, if he did not keep the Sabbath, become a sinner?" Do these signs, and then there was division among them? It's impossible for someone who is a sinner to perform signs, but he just performed one of the Messianic signs. So how can this be possible? There was confusion among all of them. It was a topic of debate, but completely. So they had to urgently call, even though it was the Sanhedrin on the Sabbath, the Sanhedrin at that moment. Something has just happened here in Jerusalem on a Sabbath day. One of the miracles we've been waiting for years to happen. That is, what's going on here. So there was confusion, some confusion, because if they had the notebook of the menu like the rabbis had, they said, "We demand that you give us an answer." That's why they brought the man before the leaders, the blind man. They brought him to the leaders and said, "We demand that you give us an answer." What's going on here? It says, "Then they said again to the blind man, 'What do you say about the one who opened your eyes?'" That is, they were so confused, so lacking in answers that they asked the blind man again. But the Jews did not believe that he had been blind. They did not truly believe that he had been blind and that he had received his sight, until they called the parents of the one who had received his sight and asked them, saying, "Is this your son? That is, the one you say was born blind. How? Does he now see?" His parents answered and said, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know either. He is of age. Ask him yourselves. He will speak for himself." They said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed that Yeshua was the Messiah, he would be expelled from the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." Up to here, a parenthesis. Remember that up to that moment, absolutely no one could recognize Yeshua as Messiah. Remember that when that man was raised, the widow of Nain called him a prophet. She said, "A prophet has arisen," but still no one could say he was the Messiah. Why? Because the Sanhedrin had not determined it publicly, so they had to publicly decide whether he was truly the Messiah or not. So if someone who was outside of the leadership said he is the Messiah, then what? Would he be expelled from the synagogue? Would he be expelled from the community? To be expelled from the community, there was also a process. That's why the blind man's parents didn't want to, it says. They were afraid of the Jews. Why were they afraid? Because they didn't want to be expelled. They lived in Jerusalem. They didn't want to be expelled from the community, so even though he had been blind, he was born blind. Ask him, he's old enough. He's of age to answer for himself. Don't get us involved in this problem. That's what the parents basically said. So in verse 24 it says, they called the man who had been blind again and told him, "Give glory to God." We know that this man is a sinner, so as they told him, be grateful that we're really here. Because if you hadn't been confused, they're telling him that man is a sinner. They're affirming it to him. In other words, in verse 25 it says, then he answered and said, "If he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." They asked him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" Again, they were confused. How can a sinner open the eyes of a blind man? How can this be possible? The blind man tells them, "I already told you. And you don't want to listen to me. You don't want to hear me because you want to hear me again. Do you also want to be his disciple?" I mean, here the blind man took courage. He was speaking against the authority of that time. So he's saying, don't you want to listen to me? You keep asking and asking and asking. Why don't you become his disciples? That's it. I mean, if one of the Messianic miracles just happened, he's telling them. And they insulted him, it says, and told him, "You are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses." Remember that Jesus had previously said, "Go according to Leviticus 3 and 14. Up to that point, Jesus was also demonstrating that he was fulfilling according to the law of Moses, everything. So they say, "We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for that one, we don't know where he is from." The man answered them, "Well, this is marvelous. Pay attention to this. This is marvelous that you don't know where he is from. And he opened my eyes. And we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Since the beginning, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of someone born blind." That is to say, it was a messianic miracle that had no precedent. Never before in the history of humanity had something like that happen. Jesus was performing one of the most key miracles of his entire era while he walked on the face of the earth. A miracle that had no precedent in history. Then the blind man says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. 34 answered and said to him, "You were born entirely in sin, and you are teaching us?" And they cast him out. Ultimately, they were so closed off by 400 years of fear of religious authority. The doctors of the law who had been put in place at that time couldn't stand against what had happened back then. There were many things happening at once. For us, that doesn't happen today. So many things together, like what Jesus did back then. Today, we look at it from this point of view and we say how incredible what Jesus did at that moment was. How did he fulfill one of the Messianic miracles? And these people couldn't grasp it? It was just too many things at once for them. It was on a day of tabernacles. It was on a Sabbath. Jesus was fulfilling several things that they had here. Like, no, this can't be possible. This can't be happening. This can't be. It can't be. It can't be. The priests were there. The priests remained silent. They didn't speak. The Levites remained silent. They didn't speak. It was simply the people against the leaders. Where was the priesthood? Why weren't they saying anything? Where were the Levites? Why wasn't anyone saying anything? So, it was the people who were demanding answers, and the leaders had also hidden themselves. They didn't know what to say, and what did they do? They went and attacked the blind man, and the blind man goes, and I imagine with the absolute authority that God had given him. After that incredible miracle, he tells them, there has never been a miracle like this before. What's wrong with you? You are the blind ones. So Jesus uses that to tell them that they are the blind ones. Later on, if you keep reading the book of John, Jesus keeps talking about this. Now, back then, to be able to reach the final point in verse 34, which was the conclusion, and they expelled him. There were 3 processes that Rabbinic Judaism, the leaders, the doctors of the law, had to carry out. One was the reprimand, which lasted 7 days. You will find the example in 1 Timothy 5, verse 1. Here it is, the Apostle Pablo. Remember that he was a rabbi of that time. He knew what he was talking about, and he was fulfilling, or he was doing things as they were done. According to the rabbinic law of that time, second was to cast out, and third is expulsion. That is, when they cast someone out, specifically they were casting them out for a determined period of time. If this person did not correct themselves after the reprimand, if they corrected themselves, good. If not, we cast them out. And finally, then comes the expulsion. In this specific case, the process that was determined did not exist with the blind man, which shows that the law rabbinic was stronger than what even they themselves had determined. That is, they had determined it has to be done this way, but even they themselves skipped the steps. So they said it wasn't finished. He was expelled. They didn't even give him 7 days of reproof. They didn't give him 30 days to come to his senses so he could understand it again, nor did they simply expel him completely. That is the miracle of blindness that Yeshua performed in his time as the Messianic Jesus, which to this day, obviously history cannot contain. Specifically, it cannot debate what happened there with the Messianic Jesus, Jesus as God. He was performing one of the incredible miracles that did not have complete precedence. We have 2 more miracles left, but I see that we've already reached the end of today's class time. I don't know how that happened, honestly. It's just that, like I told you, for me, this is one of those topics that no matter what, I have to cover. If we don't understand it and don't grasp it, there's no point in rushing through this material. So what you're going to, I think, get here is just another class. We're going to stop it here. Okay. And we're going to continue with the other 2 miracles, because the other 2 miracles are also. Of the 4 that we were supposed to see today, we were only able to see 2. I don't want to do the other 2 quickly, just to stick to today's schedule, because I think the other 2 are also incredible. Like what we just saw, because they're going to give us a much deeper understanding. So let's stop here instead. Very well, what did you think? I think many of those on the other side there have been left speechless. And if they could write me comments now, well, I invite you to write comments down below because the comments you give us are very helpful to us. So far, all the comments we've received are from pastors and leaders who are taking our online courses. That's what I wanted to tell you. We have online courses which are exclusive resources, exclusive ones that we've created for you. Before the pandemic, before the Lord spoke to us about being bridges to the outside, virtually, we used to receive tourist groups here from different parts of the world, speaking any kind of language. They would come here, and we, with the Bible open, would walk with them through the place where the events happened, open the Bible, and tell the story. This is where such a thing happened, and we would take everyone who was there back to what happened and to the event as it took place. Trying to be descriptive because that's how it is here. The people are like that. They're very visual, so we tried to be very descriptive to be able to explain it. But when the pandemic arrived, we found ourselves limited. A lot of people can't leave their homes, and many have been hit really hard economically. And the Lord has blessed us so we can bless others, and we want to help you. The Lord has told us, I want what I have given you during all these years that you have been there on earth, gaining knowledge, learning, walking, with the scriptures open. So, without further ado, I encourage you to visit the website, go, visit us, come in, learn. There are free resources for those who can't be students. Subscribe to this channel because from time to time, we will be uploading material here. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe, because that will also benefit you. It's like a kind of announcement, if I'm not mistaken, that only those who are subscribed can access. Otherwise, they forget later. Which channel did you watch this video from? So it's in your best interest to subscribe. And I think you have to press the bell icon, because every time a new video is uploaded, it notifies you that Voces de Israel, for example, has uploaded a new video. And then you can go quickly and watch it. So go ahead, and also, I advise you to share this video with others as well. There are many people who also want to learn. Maybe you say, no, I can't right now because I don't have the time. That's another topic that you can learn whenever you want. Here we usually connect twice a month via Zoom, where you, the students, connect with us through Zoom. We teach, share, and talk through the Zoom platform, and the times are arranged accordingly. We have a different set of schedules where you can select, okay, I can do this time, I can do this day, I connect, and that's how it goes. Only twice a month, and the rest, you can view the materials and resources that are already online at whatever time and schedule works for you. So what more could you really ask for? I think that for those who say, I can't, the Lord has just shown you that you actually can. Those who say, I don't have money, I think that if they do the math, they're spending it on something else. And I think it's worth making an investment here, where you will learn biblical resources from the land of the Bible, and also you will learn to have a much closer relationship with God. Because you can understand, from a point of view as we just saw in the previous class, I think I have nothing more to say. What we just saw in the previous class is incredible, and we even had to cut the class short because there is so much to share. And only those who are members, who are students, will be able to see the continuation. So it would be a shame if you don't decide today and miss the continuation of the class you just saw. It's really worth it, honestly. It's worth it, and I don't want to take up much of your time. So go quickly, visit the website. Are you still on time to sign up? In the next few days, we are going to start the next class, the class that continues live on the Zoom platform for active students. So if you can, visit now, register, and you will receive a link where you can connect. See you in class, see you in the course. Those who are students and those who are not, think, pray, seek the Lord, and may the Lord give you tranquility and peace, so that you can be part of these courses. And who says that at some point we might all meet here, physically, walking together through the land of the Bible. Blessings from Israel. Take care over there on the other side and from here. We are always praying for each one of you. We love you and we'll see you in the courses or in some upcoming video we have here. Shalom, shalom from Israel. Once again, shalom and blessings. Bye bye.